The Cold War, a battle between two superpowers, fought not on traditional battlefields but through spies, propaganda, proxy wars, and the looming threat of nuclear destruction. Today we're diving deep into the key events that define this tense era, where the world hung on the edge of a knife for over 4 decades. It all began in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. President Harry Truman made it clear that the U.S. would help any nation under threat from communism. This was the official start of the Cold War, a declaration of a global ideological struggle. The first targets? Greece and Turkey. America pledged millions in aid to stop the spread of communism, marking the beginning of the containment policy. Next, the Marshall Plan in 1948. The U.S. pumped over $12 billion into rebuilding war-torn Europe. Why? To strengthen Western Europe and prevent the appeal of communism. It wasn't just about generosity, it was a strategic move. And then the city of Berlin became the front line of the Cold War. In 1948, Stalin tried to block access to West Berlin, cutting off food and supplies in the Berlin blockade. The West's response? An airlift. For nearly a year, the US and Britain flew in essentials to keep the city alive, one of the greatest logistical feats of the Cold War. Stalin eventually gave up, but Berlin's division remained a powerful symbol. In 1950, the world saw the first true conflict of the Cold War, the Korean War. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The US, leading a UN coalition, intervened to push back the communist forces. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel, just as it started. But this conflict set the tone for future proxy wars. The world came closest to nuclear war in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Would nuclear war erupt? Finally, both sides reached a deal. The Soviets withdrew their missiles, and the US quietly removed its own missiles from Turkey. It was a high-stakes game of nuclear chicken, and humanity narrowly avoided catastrophe. The Vietnam War became the longest and most controversial of the Cold War proxy conflicts. Starting in the mid-1950s, the US tried to stop North Vietnam's communist forces from taking over the South. Despite massive US involvement, the war ended in failure for America, with the fall of Saigon in 1975. Vietnam deeply divided the US public and raised questions about the cost of fighting communism around the world. And then came the Soviets' own Vietnam, the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union wanted to prop up a communist government, but they found themselves fighting a long, brutal war against the Mujahideen, rebels backed by the US. After a decade of conflict, the Soviets withdrew in 1989. The war was a massive drain on Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the eventual collapse of the USSR. In the 1980s, both sides knew something had to give. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began to open up with reforms like glasnost and perestroika. Meanwhile, US President Ronald Reagan ramped up pressure, calling the USSR the evil empire, but also negotiating arms reductions. Then in 1989, the symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, came crashing down. Soon after, Eastern European countries broke free from Soviet control, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. From the Truman Doctrine to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War was more than a conflict. It was a battle of ideologies that shaped the world we live in today. The events of this 40-year struggle continue to echo in global politics. But in the end, the Cold War concluded without a single shot being fired between the US and the USSR. The question is, what will we learn from it?